And that, again, I come back to Polkinghorne's concept that those things could be called physical evil when they actually harm and take the lives of innocent people. But they are a component of the fact that we are in a universe that follows laws.
Is correct.
But if God hasn't...
He's betraying his own principles.
He is choosing because he is able to do so.
But you must see that you're being unscientific there. You're suddenly departing from everything you've been saying.
You must see that you're applying your own view that anything that can't be explained naturally must be an intellectual error.
And so I'll start with you, Francis, for where you go with that, because I'm sure that's an argument you've heard many times of why God should be, as it were, relegated. That, you know, there's no need now for the God explanation when it comes to the area of science that you've spent your life devoted to. And yet here you are, a very committed Christian. So just map out for us why, for you, the fact that there is an evolutionary explanation for the development of complex life does not necessarily exclude God in the process.
Well, it actually makes me even more in awe of the Creator. But let me explain. The argument from design, which Richard talked about, which had impressed him when he was younger than 16 and then sort of fell apart in the face of the evolutionary explanation. I guess that argument from design has never really grabbed me, maybe because I was already deep into the science before I started asking these questions about faith. But certainly, evolution is incredibly powerful as an explanatory science to understand the amazing diversity of creatures that we see around us and that we know have lived in the past. But I don't see how that in any way excludes the possibility that there was a plan. It's just, for me, that steps further back. And if God had the intention of ultimately putting forward on this small blue planet somewhere on the outer edge of a galaxy, creatures with big brains who would have conversations like this, and who might even be interested in whether there is something beyond what they could see materially, wouldn't evolution have been a very elegant way to do so? And if God, who's, in my sense, outside of space and time, and therefore doesn't require a way to have been begun, used this process and knew full well how it would happen because of this ability to be outside of time, I think that's just an amazing concept that brings together what I find to be really important questions about the something versus nothing and the meaning of life, together with what I know as a scientist. Because my prior for whether there's a God was not zero. It was like maybe. And as I began to look around, and I wrote a bit about this in the Language of God, and the Biologos website has lots more about it, there were in fact evidences, not proofs, we're not given that, but evidences even from science itself that something seems interesting here about the nature of the universe, as if it, as Freeman Dyson once said, almost knew we were coming.
Yeah, and in that sense, it's a sort of it's a holistic picture that draws you obviously to that conclusion, not just looking at a DNA or one particular thing. I mean, Richard, again, you'll be familiar with these sorts of arguments as well. How do you respond?
Well, Francis started to stray into the more difficult physics, the cosmology, the origin of all things. But let's just stick to evolution for the moment. I think if I were God and I wanted to create life, maybe even human life, which is part of the expectation of a religious person, I think I would not use quite such a wasteful, long drawn out process. I think I just go for it. I mean, why would you choose natural selection, which has the possibly unfortunate property that it could have come about without you? Why would God have chosen a mechanism to unfold his design? He chose the very mechanism which actually makes him superfluous. Admittedly, he could have started it off and said, God the experimenter is another matter. If his aim was an experiment to see, I wonder what would happen if I set up a primeval self-replicating molecule and then leave it to see what happens. That would be a really interesting experiment. And if God's an experimenter, I sympathize with that. But if he wanted to make complex life, I think I wouldn't choose that astonishingly wasteful, profligate, cruel, actually, way of doing. Natural selection is cruel.
Well, cruel from a human perspective, in a sense, if you put a value on it, I suppose.
Oh yes,
in that sense,
we are human, the suffering which comes from the fact that it's all about competition, it's all about evading starvation. The ones that die are the ones who are starved to death or eaten by predators, consumed by disease. It's not a benign process at all. But that's not a very important argument. That struck me as Francis was talking.
Evolution does not need God. It never has. Random mutation and natural selection fully explain how complexity builds over time. We have fossil records, comparative genomics, shared DNA between humans and chimpanzees at about 98 to 99% similarity, endogenous retroviruses in identical genome locations. That's hard biological evidence of common ancestry. None of that points to a guiding hand. And Dawkins is right. If an all-powerful God wanted humans, why drag it out for 3.5 billion years? Why billions of extinctions? Why childhood leukemia? Why parasites, starvation, and mass suffering? If God can speak the universe into existence, as Christianity claims, why not just snap his fingers and create humans instantly? Why use a blind, brutal, wasteful process that works perfectly fine without him? Genesis 1:27 says, humans were created in God's image. Evolution shows we emerged from earlier primates through gradual change. You cannot pretend those ideas line up without stretching the text beyond recognition.
You know, Richard saying, and I think it's a very common question, if God were going to create life, why this process, which on the face of it takes so long, is so cruel and wasteful in many ways. And, you know, arguably, Richard says, God's somewhat superfluous, so it's hardly as though it's providing great evidence for a designer anyway. So, yeah, where do you go with that?
Those are all really appropriate questions, and I wrestle with some of those myself. Point out a couple of things, though. One is that I don't think the fact that it took a long time should trouble us particularly. From God's perspective, yeah, it's a long time for us. But again, in this view where God is pretty much outside of space and time, it's a blink of an eye with a full knowledge of where the outcome would occur. Also, I guess, Richard, one of the things that I have come really to appreciate about this model is it says that God is really interested in order. God is not so excited about the idea of just snap the fingers and then here we all are. God wanted a universe that was going to follow these elegant mathematical laws, which, by the way, is one of those signposts that I see of an intelligence behind the universe. Einstein would have agreed with that part as well. An intelligence that also wanted it to be interesting. We could get into those constants that determine the behavior of matter and energy that seem to be just in this precise place to make something interesting happen. So if you want to accept the idea that there is some intelligence behind here, it's a pretty darn good mathematician and physicist and seems really interested in laws of nature and natural order. And so if you're going to go that way, and yet you still are interested in Richard Dawkins coming into being, well, evolution's a pretty darned impressive way to get there. Yes, I get it from our human perspective. Not the way we would have done it, but I'm always a little careful when I say, well, God should have done this differently because I would have had a better plan. And I'm me and God is God.
Yeah, it's a small point, really. I mean, I think for me, a bigger point is not to stress the fact that God is not necessary. And I think he is not necessary. But that's what most people say. I want to go further than to say he's not necessary. Somehow he really, really gets in the way of the fact that the Darwinian explanation so beautifully does away with the need for any kind of top-down design. The Darwinian explanation is a powerful antidote to the feeling that we all have because we're human, that when things are complicated, they need to be put together by somebody, in a top-down design kind of way. And if you really understand that the evolutionary process starts with simplicity and builds up to complexity and elegance and beauty and strong illusion of design, then to smuggle design in again at the beginning is to betray the entire enterprise which you've spent so long working out and building up. The enterprise has been, we now understand that you don't actually need a designer for to explain complexity. It really can come about. That's a beautiful idea. The idea that complexity and the illusion of design can happen according to the unguided laws of physics. I said can happen. Now, once you've established that it can happen, to suddenly say, oh, well, we better have God in anyway, is a betrayal of that whole argument. So I want to say that design comes in late in the universe. I fully expect that elsewhere in the universe there may be creatures far more intelligent and complex than we are, but they too will have come about by the same process of gradual, incremental, step-by-step, climbing up the ramp change. It is a betrayal of everything that Darwinism, it seems to me, stands for, to smuggle in a creator. Once you've got rid of him, then you really, let's just bring him back because it feels good to bring him back, kind of thing.
Okay. Francis.
Well, it's a lot more than feels good. I think it can be articulated as a rational choice. But basically, Richard, I am arguing not that the evolutionary process is incapable of generating complexity. I think it totally is. You and I are in the same place here.
Absolutely.
As far as the awesome
there's
way
no
in
doubt
which-
about that, yeah.
Right. But you said that, it's happened just because of the laws of physics. I want to take this back to that step. Where did those come from?
Well, let's get to that then, because you keep getting to that, and that I believe that's a very profound. I mean, if somebody was going to convince me of the need for a god, it would be there. It would be not in my own field of biology. And I found, I mean, I've read The Language of God, and indeed I reread it today. I read it first when it came out. I love your song, by the way. That's really nice. And in the audio version, I listened to the audio version today. I don't know whether you've had, Justin, but
I haven't, I'm afraid. I'll have to include it in the program at the end or something so people can hear it.
I found the initial C.S. Lewis part about the moral argument really profoundly unconvincing.
Collins moves the argument to physics and says God made the laws of nature. But there is no evidence for that. The laws of physics are descriptions of how matter and energy behave. They don't prove someone wrote them. When people talk about fine-tuning, they forget something simple. We can only exist in a universe that allows life. Of course, we observe one that works. That's not proof of design. That's basic logic. Dawkins is right. Darwin showed that simple rules can slowly build complex life. Once you show that blind natural processes can create the appearance of design, adding God back in weakens the whole explanation.
I wanted, obviously, given that you have been at the forefront of the USA's response to COVID, Francis, and we started by talking about that, to talk about that in scientific and theological terms. And again, given what we were just saying about Richard's concerns that it's very difficult to understand, if you are a Christian who believes in a loving God who could intervene, why God has allowed this kind of a universe to exist in which the natural laws take the course they do. Perhaps just to put this into context, for those who may not be familiar with the biology, just give us a very simple sort of education on the COVID virus and what caused it, why it's there, the fact that obviously not all viruses are necessarily problematic, or even we need some, but that, why this particular one has caused the amount of disruption and devastation that it has, and then where you see that fitting in, if there is really a God behind this whole thing.
So there are more viruses than there are stars in the universe. These are incredibly widespread. They affect every organism. Bacteria have their own viruses, and there's this battle going on right now in your GI tract, whether you like it or not, between the viruses that are attacking your bacteria, and let's hope the right ones win. But viruses can also cause very serious illnesses, as we all know, from things like smallpox and polio and now COVID-19. Viruses tend to be particularly dangerous for humans when they jump across from other species. And that seems most likely to be what happened here, despite various conspiracy theories. By far and away, the most likely explanation is that this virus, which was being developed in a bat, perhaps traveling through another species, got into humans, possibly in the wet market in Wuhan, China. And there it found a host that was very susceptible to its ability to multiply itself. It bound to human cells using a human protein on the surface called ACE2, which allowed that virus to get inside and then take over that host cell's machinery and replicate itself at a very rapid pace and then spread to other cells nearby. And furthermore, this virus was particularly good at making itself contagious to others around. Even people who weren't yet symptomatic could be very infectious, which is why SARS-CoV-2 has been such a bad actor and why so many people have gotten sick and died. So that is pretty consistent with what we know about other viruses. There's nothing particularly striking here, except maybe this very unusual way that people who aren't feeling sick can be super spreaders of the virus, which has made this one really successful. And of course, with evolutionary pressure, with so many people affected, mistakes made in copying the virus, most of which are deleterious, occasionally pop up with something that makes it even better at infecting people. That was alpha, and that was beta, and that was delta, and now it's Omicron, and who knows what might be next. So how did this come about? Let's be clear that this is probably, at least indirectly, a consequence of humans and animals getting really close together in ways that they traditionally have not. Bats living in caves in China generally didn't come in contact with a lot of humans, and now that's been more common. Same thing with influenza, as you all know, in terms of how that comes from birds or sometimes from pigs. This is a constant refrain, and I don't think we should blame God for that part. Now, in terms of the question about why would God allow this anyway, again, I come back to the fact that I see God as interested in natural order, and having put in place this incredibly elegant process of evolution, it would not be appropriate to sort of say, oh yeah, but you can't make viruses, evolution. You got to leave that part alone. And actually, viruses in many instances are actually part of the natural order and are not harmful. But occasionally they burst out like this. And I don't think we should blame God for that. What we should do is to try to take the tools of science, which I think are God-given, and we have the intelligence to be able to figure these things out, and use them to come up with ways to prevent and treat the disease, which is what the scientific community has been doing, as I said at the beginning, with great intensity and great effect.
Collins explains the biology correctly. Viruses mutate, they jump species. SARS-CoV-2 likely moved from bats into humans. That's zoonotic spillover. It binds to the ACE2 receptor. It spreads before symptoms. Variants like alpha, delta, and Omicron came from copying errors during replication. That's evolution in real time. No mystery there. But here's the contradiction. Collins says don't blame God because evolution and natural order are running. Yet Christianity teaches God is sovereign. Psalm 135:6 says, God does whatever pleases him in heaven and on earth. Matthew 10:29 says, not even a sparrow falls without God's will. So which is it? Is God in control or not? If God designed the system, then he designed viruses too. Smallpox, polio, COVID, millions dead globally. If he can intervene but chooses not to, that raises a moral problem. If he cannot intervene, that challenges omnipotence.
2 years.
Richard, what's firstly just your position on the actual science of how it came into being? I know that Francis obviously feels convinced that the Wuhan wet market is the most obvious explanation. Do you broadly agree with that?
I am insufficiently expert to say, and I simply enjoy listening to Francis laying it out. I mean, he's the expert. I would say viruses, they do what viruses do. I mean, that's the whole point about my gene's eye view of evolution, that the as it were teleonomic entity in the living world is the gene, and viruses are just kind of almost pure genes with a bit of protein to help them get about. The virus is the selfish gene reductio. It's the sort of epitome of a selfish gene. It does what all genes are trying to do, which is to get into the next generation, and it does it in a peculiarly direct way without bothering to build a body on the way. I mean, I've said that a rhinoceros is gene's way of making more rhinoceroses, and it's a highly elaborate. The genome of a rhinoceros is a highly elaborate computer program which says build more genes like us, and using the body of a rhinoceros as the vehicle for doing so. Well, viruses don't need to bother about that. They just go for it. They just go for replication, pure and simple, and it's entirely to be expected that they would exist. And bacteria are a bit less direct, and so on. So I can take a kind of ghoulish satisfaction in the way that viruses simply do what Darwin would have expected. I would put in a plug for Darwinian medicine, and here I pass this on to Francis as a sort of senior medical scientist in America. There is a school of Darwinian medicine which tries to look at disease from the point of view of the pathogen what the pathogen is trying to do in its life, which is to get itself propagated, and at the same time look at what the patient is trying to do, and think when an obvious example is when a patient has a high fever. Ask yourself whether the high temperature is something that the doctor ought to be bringing down because it's unnatural, or whether the high fever might be actually an adaptation by the patient to kill the pathogen, in which case it might not be the best thing. It might be the best thing to allow. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with that example, but there's a book which I recommend by Randolph Nesse and George C. Williams, late very distinguished evolutionary biologist. It's not called Darwinian Medicine, but it should have been. They gave it a bad title, which is Why We Get Sick. And a doctor is not going to buy a book called Why We Get Sick. He thinks he already knows. But if it had been called Darwinian Medicine, I think a doctor might be interested in buying it. So I think the subtitle is Darwinian Medicine. Randolph Nesse and George C. Williams. And the fever example is just the first and a very obvious one. Much less obvious one is all the ailments of pregnancy, preeclampsia, that kind of thing, can be explained as a result of, very elegantly explained, as a result of an evolutionary conflict between the mother and the fetus, because they're not genetically identical, and the fetus's genetic interest is somewhat selfish. It wants to draw from the mother more resources than the mother, evolutionarily speaking, ought to give. And so the conflict can result in an evolutionary arms race, which the main work there is by David Haig of Harvard University, and that I think is discussed in the book Darwinian Medicine. So any doctors listening in who are not familiar with this.
Viruses act exactly as evolution predicts. They mutate. The variants that spread better survive. That's why Delta replaced earlier strains. That's why Omicron spread faster. No purpose, no plan, just genetic replication under selection pressure. Now look at the contradiction. Collins says God designed this elegant natural order, but that same order produces viruses that bind to human ACE2 receptors and kill millions. If God created the system, then pandemics are built into the design. The Bible says God is loving in 1 John 4:8. It also says in Psalm 135:6 that God does whatever pleases him. So either God designed a system that includes mass viral death, or he cannot control it. Both options clash with the idea of a perfectly loving, all-powerful being.
Might like to look up that book.
And on that subject, Francis, given that you both believe that in a sense evolution drives these forces, both the aspects of ourselves that kind of tend towards our healing and our health and so on, but also these forces that are in competition with us, the virus that wants to replicate itself and will use whatever host it can lay its hands on in the course of that. For you, this obviously, for Richard, this doesn't sit well with the idea that there's a God on top of this whole thing. But for you, you're really happy to say it's the sort of the sharp end of the kind of deal we've got, as it were, as embodied conscious agents, that this is the kind of world God had to put us in order for us to be the kind of people we are. Is that what you're saying there?
That's what I'm saying, and to follow natural laws and order in the universe, just as tectonic plates must slip in order for this planet to be what it is. And so viruses must come into being if evolution is going to run all of the programs that it has capable of doing to generate interesting biological outcomes. And that, again, I come back to Polkinghorne's concept that those things could be called physical evil when they actually harm and take the lives of innocent people. But they are a component of the fact that we are in a universe that follows laws. And I don't think we'd want to be in one that didn't.
I get that. And I mean, that would be a consistent position to take, were it not for your belief in miracles. I mean, I say again, you can't have it both ways. I mean, God should not be doing miracles if what you say about earthquakes is correct.
But if God hasn't,
he's betraying his own principles.
He is choosing, because he is able to do so, those moments of remarkable importance to convey a message to his creatures that would be you and me, in a way that the miraculous may be able to achieve. And again, if God's the author of all of this, I don't see why God should not be allowed, when it suits
He
his
can.
nature, to change things.
Yeah. He would have the power to, but then, okay, I'm not going to intervene in this earthquake, because that would be inconsistent with the desire to let things play out. But I am going to intervene to heal, whatever it was called, Jairus' daughter, or raise Lazarus from the dead.
It's funny you mentioned that story, Richard. I was only reading that to my 6-year-old son this evening in bed. So the healing of, and it comes at the point where the power has gone out of Jesus as a woman touches his hem on the way to.
I don't think Francis believes in those. Do you believe?
Okay, well let's do you believe in these miraculous healings of Jesus?
I think they're recorded by reliable witnesses who observe these things to happen, and I have no reason, therefore, to question them more than I do to question the resurrection, which is the most critical miracle of all. And without resurrection, my Christian faith really doesn't have any substance.
Yeah, but okay. I mean, so you don't intervene with earthquakes, you don't do any other miracles, no miracles, and then suddenly, during a 30-year period, from 0 AD to 38 AD, a whole spate of miracles happen. It doesn't add up.
Well, it was not just any 30-year period, Richard. It was the moment where God actually became human. And if there was ever a moment, therefore, where the miraculous could be experienced by humanity, that would be it.
But you must see that you're being unscientific there. You're suddenly departing from everything you've been saying.
You must see that you're applying your own view that anything that can't be explained naturally must be an intellectual error. And you and I are different in that regard. I'm allowing the possibility of the supernatural, a creator God who's responsible for everything.
Yeah, I'm kind of amazed, actually, that I don't want to get into biblical scholarship, but you must be aware that a huge number of biblical scholars don't take all the miracle stories seriously.
I am aware, and I will be happy to listen to their arguments if there are specific ways to discount one or the other. When it comes to the resurrection, though, please read Tom Wright's wonderful book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, if you want to see the kind of scholarship that anyone would want to ask for the most significant miracle of all time.
This is where it gets intense. Collins says earthquakes and viruses must happen because God respects natural laws. Fine. But then he says God steps in to perform miracles, raising Lazarus, healing the sick, resurrecting Jesus. You can't hold both positions without tension. If God won't stop tectonic plates from killing thousands because natural order matters, why suspend biology and physics for selected miracles in first-century Judea? Science works because laws are consistent. Miracles depend on those laws being broken. Notice the shift. When explaining COVID, Collins leans fully on mutation, ACE2 receptors, replication biology, solid science. But when defending resurrection, we're asked to trust ancient texts written decades later as historical proof. Even many scholars debate their reliability. Extraordinary claims require strong evidence. So here's the real question. If natural laws explain the world so well, why step outside them only when defending faith? Let us know what you think in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe.